Now that we have talked about overloading, it is time to make a mention of a special trick. We're going to see how we can use this with a pair of parentheses. Remember, we have used this dot something, usually that something being a field of the class, many times so far. Now we're talking about something different. We are talking about this with a pair of parentheses. We are using this with a pair of parentheses to invoke one constructor of the class from another constructor within the same class. So we have overloaded the constructor and we are using this in the constructor body, which will have as a result to call another constructor of the same class. There is a limitation that this, if we want to use it, must be the very first line in the current constructor. What will happen is that if the class has, say, 3 constructors, Java will match the argument type that we will put inside the parentheses of this and will call the constructor that is matching the argument type. Now the other constructor will return again to the calling constructor once it is done with its job. Let's see an example of how we can call one constructor from another within the same class and why we might want to do that. This simple class of a Purdue student has 2 fields, the name of the student and the Purdue ID. And we have just started a main method, our program, where we will be creating Purdue student objects. So let's go and write a constructor for this class. How well will it look like? We may want to write it so that we provide as argument to the constructor, say, the student ID. So we will have the ID as a parameter, and then we will do this dot Purdue ID becomes equal to the value of the parameter, right? Whoops. This looks like a reasonable constructor, so we could go and say, for example, for this particular Purdue student reference variable, that it is going to refer to a new Purdue student with ID some random number. Okay. Now, what if we want to also have a constructor that not only gives a value to the Purdue ID, but also gives a value to the name of the student? We definitely could have something like that. And since we can use our copy-paste ability, you already see that I cannot just have the same signature for the 2 methods. We will need to have a different parameter type. So here is what will make this constructor different, and we may want to say this.name becomes equal to name in the same fashion. Now, notice the following. This is an example class where we don't really have that many fields. It could very well be the case that inside the first Purdue student constructor, we were doing all sorts of things. We were initializing a good amount of variables, and all that same initialization we would actually like to happen even when we were calling the second constructor, even when we were creating a Purdue student through the second constructor. So here is a Purdue ID. I'm not being very consistent here with the numbers. I'm not doing any checks, but this is not the point of this particular example. And this is a random name for the name of the person. So instead of repeating all of the initializations that we are doing anyway in this first constructor, and again, remember, we might have many different fields here and doing all sorts of things inside this first constructor, instead of repeating all that code which we actually want to keep, what we could do would be to insert a call to the very first constructor. And this is how we do it. We write this with a pair of parentheses. Now, inside the pair of parentheses, you already see the error that IntelliJ IDEA has marked. The pair of parentheses is not just there for pretties. It is exactly the same as we were invoking a method. The other constructor takes as a parameter a Purdue ID. So we need to supply an argument here, and that will be easy because we already have the value that we need to supply. So what will happen when the second type of constructor is called? See what will happen when the Purdue student object assigned to P2 is being created. The second constructor will be invoked, but the very first thing that the second constructor will do will be to invoke the first constructor, do the initialization that is defined there. The first constructor will complete its job, and then the second constructor will continue from where it left. It will initialize the extra field that it has, and then it will complete its job. This is how we can supply two different constructors and have one use the other, and why it might be beneficial to do that. Let's continue with our example one step further. Suppose that we actually wanted to print the information for the students at some point. So we want to have a print method which prints any information that we have about the student. So we would like to be able to write in our program p1.print student, and then the same thing with p2. The difference here is that for the p1 object, the object referenced by p1, we have only the Purdue ID, while for the second object we have both Purdue ID and name. How can we call the print student method in such a way that it gives us all of the information in both cases? You see, we could definitely have inside the print we could definitely have something that only prints the Purdue ID number. Purdue ID is, and then the instance variable. However, if we just implement the print student in this fashion, we will not print information that we do have for P2. We will not print the name of that student. So what can we do? One thing we could do is have an additional variable which tells us whether or not we have the additional information for this particular object. We could have a Boolean variable called hasName, for example. And in the case that we invoke the second constructor, hasName is true. We do have the name for that student. While in the first case, we make hasName false. And then we can use this variable that we just defined inside the print student. And we can say, if the student has a name, then we would like to print that name. System.out.println actually. Otherwise, we don't have the information, we don't want to print it.